as to tonight's topic, the grand jury report into clergy sex abuse, the investigation completed a few months ago by the 40th statewide investigating grand jury, which found widespread and systemic abuse of children, more than 1,000 children, across 7 decades by more than 300 priests in 6 dioceses. This grand jury now comes on top of the investigations into the Altoona-Johnstown investigation, which was done in 2016, as well as the 2 investigations into the Archdiocese of Philadelphia from 2005 and 2011. In one word, have you described what this latest grand jury report means to you, like what your reaction is to this grand jury report? Orlando.
It's disgusting.
Shame. Long overdue.
Eye-opening.
Heartbreaking.
Atrocious.
Shameful.
Painful.
Unsurprising.
I'm having a hard time choosing one. Incomplete, I think, because a lot of that's been redacted.
Unsurprised.
I was with the disgusting.
Innocent.
Interesting. Okay, back to you. Let's talk about.
Word. Would you give me that word for, Keith?
Let's talk about your thoughts about the accountability of the church and how it has failed over all these years, according to all these different investigations, not only here in Pennsylvania, but across the state, across the country, in Boston, in LA, Minnesota, everywhere we look. There are investigations, and the findings are the same. Let's talk about the accountability of the church and sort of the, at times, complicity of officials and law enforcement to allow this to happen.
Are you saying to allow it to happen?
Yeah.
To start, I think if the church hierarchy is complicit, then they're just as guilty, and that's the way they should be viewed. They've abetted in a crime, and they should face the consequences of what that is.
I agree with that, absolutely.
I think forever it was just a blind trust that people had in religion, particularly the Catholic religion, that they were just held so high that no one questioned. So.
I was thinking about this, Evie, and I'm 67 years old, and we've been talking about this for much of my lifetime. And I didn't go to Catholic school, but I have friends that went to Catholic school. And when I thought about it, it really was a culture of abuse, from the nuns smacking kids on their hands with rulers. I have a friend who sneezed in a class, and the nun turned around and slapped her in the face. And I'm like, wow, that's extreme. That's, you know, that seems like an extreme culture to have in a church setting, you know.
To add to Keith, going to Catholic school and being 65, I remember getting hit by the nuns, and it's funny because you remember things when you're young. I remember classmates, females, needing to go to the restrooms. Nuns wouldn't let them go, and they would wet themselves, and that was a punishment for them. That you should hold it. But it's also from my family. If I would have gone and said, well, the nun did this or the priest did that, it was, well, you deserved it. So there is that culture that they grew up in. We're the masters. We can do what we want.
Did you want to say something, Mark?
Well, yes. In the report, the leading priest, the #1 priest listed for the Archdiocese of Greensburg was our priest for our parish, Father Denny. and he sexually assaulted at least 4 boys, 2 of which lived in my neighborhood, and we all knew about it growing up, and it wasn't, so the report wasn't a surprise to me. And Father Denny was transferred and got some rehabilitation, and he was transferred to a new parish where he continued to be a priest for his flock, so to speak. And he later on, years later, died of HIV. But this has been known for decades, so the report, the grand jury report, was not surprising to me at all. But the conclusion that I draw is the civil remedies that exist at law now have not been sufficient to stop the church hierarchy from continuing to be involved in covering up these incidents. And so one of the columns that I wrote was about reforming the RICO statute, even on the criminal side, to give prosecutors real teeth to go after the church hierarchy that's involved in covering this up.
Why do you think that an entire community, in your case, Greensburg, you said, right?
Right.
So you have an entire community, you have parishes, you have families, and then you have that rumor, you know, under the radar, people talking, people knew, you knew about these priests. Why is it that as a Catholic community, they're willing to allow that to happen?
That's a great question. In our case, he was transferred and he went to get, I guess, sexual offender rehabilitation. And he went to some sort of treatment center for some period of time, and he was out of sight, out of mind. And the hierarchy at the time said it's taken care of. But then we find out later that after he was in that rehabilitation center for a period of time, he was transferred to a new parish and continued in the priesthood. So that's an example of the church hierarchy just trying to move him out of our community, and we had a new priest in and out of sight, out of mind.
That was standard practice.
Yeah, standard.
Priests were usually around for 3 years, and they rotated them.
Mm-hmm.
They moved somewhere else, and no one, at least I didn't, I mean,
You
little
did
did
not-
we know
Did
that
not
that was
survive.
the reason,
Mhm.
you know, years later.
Vincent?
So far as the history of the church, which is over 2,000 years, and in management school we heard that it was the largest organization and the oldest organization. So management studies are done on this big, huge bureaucracy over the whole world. And if we know Old Testament, there was a veil between the people and the temple. And then after, I guess, 1970s, they had what is called Vatican II, which separated the which got rid of the veil between the priests and the people. It lowered that. So the priest no longer had his back to us and was no longer a step down from Jesus Christ himself. So they became more human. And in that transition, it's still transitioning over 30 years, where people are learning that, and the church is also opening themselves, with John Paul especially, to let the lay people participate in the church. So before, they didn't ask us and we didn't ask them. They were the church and we were the flock, and we were to do what they said. And what happened between ecclesiastical things, that was for the priests and the hierarchies, and we really didn't see it. And so far as the rumors, we could get excommunicated and things like that. So the church was growing into the freedom to where we are now at the point to where people are finding this out, and the church is learning to deal with it. So they were very authoritarian, which is their history for many, many years. And now they're moving to more egalitarian, but there's still that older people who are used to the church being all powerful and all right, and other people who are growing, and the newer people who are coming to make it more egalitarian. So that the dichotomy of the two people in the church, the two generations, the number of generations are coming together to where this is coming to light and we're pressing it. And also priests, the newer priests who are coming in and bringing these views that we need to get rid of the evils that are in our church.
Tiffany?
Coming from a town, like my town is very, very religious. We have many churches, so a lot of people, especially in my high school, were like loyal Sunday churchgoers. And I feel that things like this were overlooked for the fact that they were a little desensitized to it. Like, in our age group, believe it or not, the jokes were made about the priests and the children. Like, that was a running joke. as we grew up, that was put in cartoons, it was put in shows, and it was just like, that doesn't happen in real life. Like, no one really felt that was a thing. And I know a lot of kids in my specific year were die-hard with their churches, and they would always participate, and there was no wrong that their priests or fellow churchgoers could ever do because they felt that they were above that. And I could definitely see how it would just feel too surreal to have that be a real thing that happens. I know it's kind of odd to be like, it's a running joke for us, but like, that was something you would just see in our culture a lot. Like, don't be an altar boy because you know what happens, and that was something that was said. And I really do feel like kids saw that, and so they don't look at what's actually happening in front of them as much because of that like stigma that just desensitized them to it actually happening.
A lot of denial.
Yeah.
To build on Tony's point, again, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a couple of things happening. First of all was we were much more questioning authority much less in those times. And understand this is an organization, the head of which is deemed infallible. And if the head of the organization is infallible, then I believe that promotes within that organization kind of a, we can get away with anything, a license. And in so doing, it's easier to move your problem than it is to solve your problem. To solve your problem may have financial consequences as well.
Tony, I want to hear what you have to say, but I also, after that, want you to elaborate on what you meant by innocent.
Okay, on the first, I haven't been Catholic since my first Holy Communion at age 8, and I'm way past age 8.
Just a little.
But we have these guys, and I have no doubt there was sexual harassment in the church. No doubt in my mind at all, okay? But we've convicted these people, these priests. The allegations against them are real. We know that. But in a court of law, they haven't been convicted. And since when has the United States found someone guilty before they went through the court? That bothers me. And like I say, I truly believe there's been sexual harassment for as long as there's been a Catholic Church.
Well, it was a grand jury investigation.
But they didn't convict him. They just listened to the complainant. I'm going to complain tomorrow to the Harrisburg Patriot that she accosted me. She made sexual advances at me. Now, that's not true. But is she in trouble? Do you have to investigate her? This is what I'm saying. And like I say, I was golfing yesterday. One of the guys was an active Catholic. And in conversation, he said that Joe Schmo, that he went to Lebanon Catholic High School with, called him up about something, and they were talking. And the guy said, do you remember the name of our history teacher? And he said, yeah, it was Father so-and-so. He said, well, you know, if they find him guilty, I'm going to jump in on a bandwagon. I'm going to say he sexually abused me and get some money. And we laughed about it, okay? And the guy on the phone also laughed. He wasn't going to do that, I don't think. So what I'm saying is, let's convict these guys before these priests, before we pass sentence.
Well, they have to be tried. They have to be tried. They have to, you have to sue them.
Yes, they have to go through trial.
You sue them, you take them through the court system. But none of these cases can be taken through the court system because the statute of limitations have expired.
But if you change that law, and they should, you know, make it to the mature 18 or 21, whatever maturity date it is they want to set. But all those thousands of cases cannot be tried at this time because the law wasn't there at that point.
Which is why they're calling for a
They're gonna lose-
retroactive.
If they expand it to a lifetime,
Let's
those
hear,
people aren't going to be able to go to court.
let's hear from Tom.
The judge could speak to this better than I can, but I taught criminal law at the State Police Academy for 8.5 years. You cannot enact a retroactive law that's not constitutional.
Not criminal. You can't do criminal,
But you can,
but you can do civil.
well, if, the
Right?
Supreme Court, yeah, theoretically, right, Judge?
Ex
What'd you
post
say?
facto
Wake up,
legislation,
Jim.
that's criminal, yes.
Yeah.
Civil has constitutional issues too.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they're gonna try to do, but it has
Dozens of
constitutional.
states
Yeah.
have passed them. There's been no problems with them. They've
I
held.
don't know, it has issues, it has issues. It has practical problems too. I didn't want to interrupt it.
No, I just want to finish quickly. I'm a recovering Catholic. I got a bloody nose from a nun. I probably deserved it. I mean, I was just a typical young kid. Grew up in a very Catholic family. As I said, I'm a recovering Catholic. So I go to church, I take the sacraments, I go to see the liturgy. I walked out of one church here in the local area because he started to go into the left lane very quickly when I walked out. So it's my church, it's between my church and me and God. But we all knew, I was in the state police for 11 years, we all knew what was going on. And as this gentleman back behind me says, the church was infallible in the 40s and 50s and early 60s. You didn't question it. We knew what was going on. They transferred them. They sent them to some place, was it Arizona or someplace, to cure them of pedophilia?
Yeah. New Mexico.
Or someplace, I don't know. And then brought them back.
But why, you're telling me that the state police knew about it, but did nothing?
I can't speak to what the state police did as an agency. I just know what I know from having worked on the road. And I only spent 11 years before I retired and moved on. But
Keith,
it was known.
did you want to add a little more on the constitutionality of?
Well, that's another subject, but let me just say this. What I've heard, first of all, in any society, you're going to have your share of what I call perverts, for want of a better term. You're going to have plenty of them. They're going to be everywhere, more or less. The Catholic Church is an institution that lends itself to the physical dynamics for that to occur. It has now been indicted, and indicted is not convicted, has been indicted by the grand jury. And the grand jury basically says Father X or layperson, whatever, it's not just priests, there are others too, has done this, that, or the other thing, and half of them have died and others have been disposed of. But the church then went ahead and did certain things. How it addressed those things was by transfers. All right, now those were attitudes that the church had, and those attitudes somewhat reflect attitudes of the community. And I can speak to attitudes of the community going back well over 40 years to an actual situation that I was involved in as a district attorney in Perry County about the school teacher. So you have institutions. One of the most horrendous murder cases I ever had was a scoutmaster in a pedophilia type situation. And this is what you're talking about. Now the school teacher situation came to our attention. The local sergeant of the state police and I investigated in our own time over months. These things take a long time. You don't just get prepubescent boys into your office at night. You just don't bring them in. You got to talk to their parents, if you can find the parents. And sometimes you can't, or there's only one. You hit a lot of reluctance to come in and say these terrible things about a school teacher. We look up to our teachers. We certainly look up to our priests. Hopefully we look up to our judges and our lawyers and so on and so forth, you know. So, but in any event, one of the things that I recall, well, two things. One, the school district. I advised the school district as to the evidence that we had. And the school district's attitude was this: you convict them, we'll fire them. We're not going to attempt to do anything of a disciplinary mode at this point until it was actual conviction. Well, we did convict them later on. But here's the thing, and here's the community attitudes that I represented at the time, and I'm not particularly proud of this. But basically what we did was, we told that teacher, you show up for class on Monday, you get busted. If you don't show up for class, then here's what you can do to prevent being busted. You can resign, and you can stay out of any environment where there are going to be kids. Okay? He told us where to go. We ended up convicting him. And we barely convicted him. It was and we worked hard on the case. It was a good, solid case. The judge fined him $200, put him on probation for 2 years. Within a week, I go to a football game, and there's the guy running the chains at a football game. So what were the community attitudes at that time? And what are the standards by which he's judged at this point? One of the things that bothers me, and it should bother you, and I think it does, is that there was conduct of whatever nature, 20, 30, 40, 60 years ago, that has statute of limitations implications, of course, as it should. And that conduct was judged by the standards that existed at that time, as the way I did it. Now, if I would have done that yesterday, I could have possibly been indicted for endangering the welfare of a child for not doing something about this teacher. And I'm not particularly proud of that, but this is what we did. This is how we did things. Okay. Now, a guy like Sandusky, for example,
I was just thinking.
it took months and months, if not years, to investigate a terrible criticism. This political, terrible, terrible, that's all done to get clean. Now, that investigation had to take a long, long time because, and I can speak from experience as to how that thing worked out. But the conduct that he engaged in, and I have no doubt he is where he belongs and so on and so forth, but the conduct that I represented, or I referenced to you, the scoutmaster, other school teachers, probably Methodist ministers, if you looked at it close enough, that conduct is being judged today by today's standard, and today's standard could well change by tomorrow.
Well, and let's talk about that, because that's, one of the things now happening is that the victims are advocates, and a large part of government and lawmakers are calling for that change, right? So they're calling for this sweeping reform bill that would not only reform the law going forward, but would also retroactively open a path for these victims to sue in civil court. Let's talk about that. The church has historically waged a very powerful battle with powerful lobbying, a lot of money. So here we are again. There, basically we're facing the same circumstance where we have the Catholic Conference and other interests up against the momentum from more progressive minds to not only reform the law, but the retroactive component is really a linchpin for a lot of victims. Let's talk about that. Is that the right way to go? Is it the right way to go to allow these victims, some of whom are 70 years old, to finally have their day in court? Many of them say this is their only way, their only path to healing, their only path to closure, is to have this day in court. And it's not about the money, they say. It's not about, what are they going to collect?
That's about maybe 40% true, 60%.
All right. So let's talk about that.
When you peel the onion back, it's about money. The church does not want to open itself up to that much liability. The report, the grand jury report came out. Thus far, the church has fought all of the reforms that are written in that report. They haven't adopted anything.
I spent some time last night with the Fortney sisters. Some of you may know who they are. They are, at least 5 of them have come public with the story of their abuse at the hands of the same priest. So one priest from the Harrisburg Diocese abused 5 sisters from this family of 11. beginning back in 1982. One of the sisters last night made a point that, yes, the church everywhere basically uses this argument that, oh, we're going to go bankrupt, and Catholic Charities helps the poor, and we're not going to be able to, serve the poor. And that's an aside, because Catholic Charities is widely funded by the public's money, not the church money. But she said, sooner or later, everyone pays. We paid through the opioid crises. We paid through suicide programs and prevention because of the rate of suicide among victims, the rate of just violence and sexual assault among victims, eating disorders. So she just said that sooner or later, we all pay. So, but we're not the guilty party. Why not force the church, who was the one who enabled the abuse to happen in the first place? Why doesn't society enable the church?
I went on the internet today because of this meeting, and I got a report here. They call it the John Jay report. Something happened down in Texas. The conference of Catholic bishops got together with people, and they set up a bunch of rules for themselves. Now, obviously they didn't follow them. Some priests did not follow them. And they're, according to this, if somebody complains about abuse, they will pay medical bills, but not money in the guy's pocket. Now, I don't know if this is true. All I know is that this is what I got off the internet. And they said that there were, and this is from 1950 to 2002, there were over 10,000 people who made allegations against the church.
I think against 4,000 priests. Don't quote me on that, but I think it was 4,000 priests that had been named as predators.
I'd like to say, I think the church should pay. We can't make things right, and money is not going to compensate the victims for all that they have suffered. But it's something, and they wanted an apology and deserve an apology, and I think they're getting that, and they're getting heard. So I think that if the church can compensate in some way, and I think if it hurts the church, then it hurts the church. I think the church stands a better chance of reorganizing and coming back together again after that. But I think it's going to turn into a much wider picture as you try to change the statute of limitations. You can't do that just for the Catholic Church.
And a lot of the victims say that they would rather have a clean church that is made up of 5 people than to have a church packed with thousands of people but have it be a dirty church. Mary Ann?
I'm just wondering how you legitimize all these complaints and claims, especially if you're trying to go retroactive. I mean, what's the test? What's the litmus test to say that you were actually abused, assaulted, or whatever?
Well, I hope the legal experts in the audience will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in a regular court proceeding, it's up to the
jury?
The accuser, right? The accuser has to prove himself or herself.
Civil case, the plaintiff has the burden of proof by preponderance of the evidence. Criminal case, the Commonwealth has the burden of proof by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. No prosecution can occur unless it's within the statute of limitations. Now, what you're talking about is spreading some of the risk around here and getting it into a forum. Once you get it into a forum, that's a court. And one of the biggest problems that plaintiffs can have if they don't promptly file is the fact of the lack of a prompt complaint. Now, there's lots of reasons why complaints don't get made promptly, but those are also factors when it comes to whether or not the burden of proof, criminally or civilly as the case may be, can be carried. So I think the real issue here to address the situation is whether or not the forum can be opened up by the statute of limitations approach. Then the lawyers and the judges will take it from there, and we do a pretty decent job of it.
Yeah, I would say bringing a civil claim on behalf of a claimant is for sexual assault in the civil context is a very difficult claim to bring, because as you're watching the Judge Kavanaugh hearings today, it's essentially a he said, she said, or a he said case. There's very little direct evidence. There's usually never any physical evidence. They're very difficult cases to bring in the first place. But I do think that this retroactive two-year retroactive statute of limitations to bring civil claims does make sense in this regard because of how extensive the 40th grand jury investigation report was, in that through the power of the grand jury, they were able to go to these various dioceses and extrapolate evidence really against the will of the church officials, and they got that evidence through the power of the grand jury, and then they put it in a report and released it. So now you have it's not as daunting of a task. It's still very difficult, but at least you have some evidence now to work with when you bring a civil claim. So I understand the issue with the possible constitutional predicament whenever the General Assembly is going to reform the statute of limitations. But in this regard, with the two-year retroactivity on a civil case, I think that it has a lot of common sense behind what the legislature is doing.
But if it's just a civil case, it's still not holding the people accountable, correct?
Well, that's right, and that's why the position that I've taken is we need to go after the actual culprits in criminal court. We've done it once in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia District Attorney achieved a successful prosecution of Monsignor Lin on a child endangerment criminal charge. It's very difficult to do. Even more difficult than a civil claim is to get a conviction in criminal court beyond a reasonable doubt of a supervisor priest on a child endangerment charge. Very difficult, but it has been done. But what I'm arguing for is a reform of our RICO statute, the statute that was designed to go after the mob, where the individuals at the top don't commit the crimes directly. They just cover up the crimes that are committed in the lower ranks. And if you reform that criminal statute, you'll give prosecutors a much more powerful tool to go after the actual culprits in the aiding and abetting and the covering up. And I think that's where you hit the church hard.
Vincent has hand up.
Okay, I'm a lifelong Catholic. All you need is I'm also a minister in my church, an elector, a Catholic, a definite serious Catholic. And I'm very happy I'm not hearing any abusive things that I've really heard which have been disgusting me. The church is the people, okay, not the hierarchy. I heard RICO, and I'm not sure if I understand it. If we all were serious about this, we'd go for the heart of the issue. We go to canon law, and I heard RICO. That sounds to me that we should make an international case against the country, Rome.
I've actually written about that, and what I found was that it's actually very hard to bring the Pope or the Vatican into a suit in the United States.
We can hold their money.
Sovereign immunity.
Yep, sovereign immunity is one of them.
Do it with Iran and other countries.
Tom?
He and I are in violent agreement. I've worked RICO cases. All you need is a predicate offense. Predicate offense can be conspiracy. It can be almost anything. But it has to be within the statute of limitations. Statute of limitations for most of these, almost all of these, except I think 3, is it? It's 5 years.
At least 2, yeah.
It's 5 years. So you can beat your head against the wall all you want, but you're not going to get them criminally if you're gone beyond the 5-year window.
We keep going back and forth, talking about criminal prosecution and civil prosecution. And criminal prosecution, you're right, that's going to be a slog. The civil prosecution, the argument that we're hearing against extending the statute, and I agree they should add the additional time. Look at the nature of the crime. It's not a crime that's reported immediately. If I steal your car, when are you going to report it?
Right away.
Right away. If I beat up your sister, when are you going to report it? right away. If I murder your mother, when are you going to report it? Right away. If I sexually assault you, statistics tell us that is not reported right away, and in most cases, it goes unreported.
Right.
So now, because of the nature of the crime, the victims are being penalized for not, well, why didn't they say something 35 years ago? Why didn't they say something 2 weeks after it happened? Why didn't they tell their mother, their father, their district attorney? What? Because of the nature of the crime. And I think we're losing sight of the fact that that crime is so different and so personal to these victims that it just places it outside the realm of all these other crimes. You know, we've heard, well, why not change the statute for other crimes? Well, understand, it's not apples and apples.
And that's a great segue into sort of the bigger picture that is playing out right now with the Kavanaugh hearings, where you have, you know, at issue the credibility being questioned of a woman who, you know, alleges sexual misconduct and assault from this judge, and sort of you talked about the standard, the public standard. Let's talk about that, Keith.
Well, the Kavanaugh hearing today, a comment was made that sexual abuse is inherent in this country. It has always been here, you know? So again, trying to show the big picture. And we're outraged because it exists in the church. But what exists in the church exists in society, you know? But the question is, in society, we have a way to solve it. You take the person to court. If they're convicted, they go to jail. Why isn't it the same in the church?
Well, it would be if somebody reported it to the authorities
Right.
instead of covering it up.
Yeah, take child abuse in a school. That's not reported either.
Yeah, Mark?
What's not reported, Heather?
Child abuse in the school.
Child abuse in a school, and I mean, we have local scenarios that have happened in the last few years where we've received teachers who were doing sexual misdeeds in Philadelphia, and those teachers were not reported properly, and we hired them here in Susquehanna Township. We hired them, and then they had sex with middle school students. You know, so how about the people that didn't report those teachers properly and didn't investigate them when we hired them here? I mean, talk about criminally endangering our youth. It's across the board. And when I say we don't care about children, that's what it looks like. It looks like holding all those people accountable, including our public officials and teachers and so on.
Marianne.
I have a question for Mark, kind of segueing over in your home school where you went to
Yes.
school, and those 3 or 4 kids that you knew that were sexually assaulted, did they tell their parents? Or was it
Yes.
just something that you guys just knew about?
No, they told their parents, and the parents actually brought suit against the church, and there was a significant settlement that was reached.
Okay. So they did have something, some conclusion there that...
They did,
sort of
yes. Yeah,
resolution.
their lives were destroyed.
Yes.
They have they have significant personal problems that developed as a result of this.
They're
So I
paid
kinda-
compensatory damages, right? Is that what you're talking about? Compensatory damages,
Yes,
that was it.
yeah.
What happened to the perpetrators?
The perpetrator was sent away to receive sexual offense rehabilitation for a brief period of time, and then he was relocated to a new parish. And he didn't last too long there. A year or two later, he died of AIDS. That's Father Denny. He's in the Archdiocese of Greensburg. He's the first priest listed.
Did that start in Pottsville?
So are we seeing
Greensburg.
parallels? Are we seeing any resonance between what's happening with the church crises and this Supreme Court hearing?
We are. And in Maryland, there is no statute of limitations for a felony sex offense, which is not the case in Pennsylvania, although it's being discussed, and there are bills in the House and the Senate to eliminate the statute of limitations for a felony sex offense case in Pennsylvania. Now, put yourself, now look at Judge Kavanaugh. He could be charged criminally in Maryland right now for felony sex assault. He has to defend himself against these allegations that are 36 years old. And you see how distraught both parties are in this case, because they're both having trouble telling their story and proving their story to everyone who's listening intently, because the story is so old and it's so hard to corroborate. And the Carbon County District Attorney made a statement about the effort in the House in Pennsylvania to eliminate the criminal statute of limitations, and the DA said, and Judge Quigley can opine too, that it's not necessarily, it doesn't make it any easier for the prosecutor when you eliminate the statute of limitations. It may make it more difficult. It may serve as a disincentive, and to allow people to take longer periods of time before they come forward. If they come forward right away, it's easier to build a case against the accused.
Well, and this is reflective of how our society treats children.
Exactly.
I mean, my daughter has adopted 2 children. They were the 2 youngest out of 7. The oldest child in the family was 9. Now, the adoption went on they were in foster care. That went on for years. And the mother was convicted of dog abuse, 49 counts of dog abuse, and she was sentenced in Virginia to jail time. It was all over the Washington Post. So she's sentenced for dog abuse, but for child abuse, nothing. And the state paid for all of their appeals up to the Virginia Supreme Court for these children to be returned to the parents who'd already been,
It is true that the attitudes of society to protect children. I drove by the Marysville Moose Lodge today, and out there it says, "Protect our children." Is what it says right on their logo. And yes, I think we all have a natural inclination to protect our children. In fact, most of us here would probably risk our lives to save the life of a child if we could do that. But it's not really reflected. And the kids can't say anything themselves. And then when you get the situation exacerbated by it being a priest or the scouts or respected adults, it makes it really difficult to be taken credibly. And that's how many cases, and you've published a lot of work on where allegedly the child care people have fallen down, have not followed up, and so on and so forth. There was a time when the child care didn't even exist. I remember when it didn't exist. Didn't even have it, at a municipal level. And then, of course, it's evolved ever since, and does it do a good job? Does it do a bad job? The attitude is you mess with somebody's family, you really get in trouble if you're from the county. Here, I'm from the government and I'm here to help attitude, and a lot of people get upset about that. So there is no question about that. Women to a lesser degree because they're big people. They can talk or they can understand. But yes, our attitudes, if you read, and I'm a big nut on English history, you read stuff like that, women were,
Keith?
Yeah, I know we're kind of drawing to a close, and Judge, you reminded me with the moose thing, but I want to bring it even closer to home. In the Bible, it says, Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." And I always took that to mean something from outside of the church shall not prevail against it. Never did I think it was within the church.
Yeah, and Pope Francis this week spoke about that. He spoke about how the church is imperiled by the loss of the confidence and credibility from its youth, And once you lose the youth, you're going to lose the church, because when the grandmas and grandpas pass away and there's no one coming up behind them, who do you have? You haven't said anything, Samantha. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's been moments I've been wanting to speak, but then we get really political, and I'm just, well, more term-wise, and I'm not just unfamiliar, honestly. But to branch off, Keith, of what you said of how we don't expect these things to form within the church, but then when we ask if we're surprised or not surprised these things are going on, we're like, no, we're not surprised at all, because we know it's been a constant issue for years, which is quite unfortunate. And I went to Catholic school K through 7th grade, and I am 20 years old. So around the time when I was there, there wasn't much, nuns and teachers weren't allowed to hit their students or use abuse as a sort of discipline. But we were all aware that in the Catholic religion, I feel like there is a lot of rules, a lot of discipline, just in general, whether it's how you stand in Mass or just how you live your lifestyle. I personally don't identify with Catholic as a particular faith, even though I was raised with my sacraments and all that. But we also were mentioning how sexual assault is one of those crimes where it takes a long time for you to be able to talk about it because of that psychological impact. And I feel like since a lot of the victims in the diocese in the Catholic Church are children, that's a reason why this issue has been so prolonged, because those victims aren't able to understand really what was happening or be able to talk about it in a coherent way where they could do it in court. But also, they're supposed to have trust in these figures in general, whether it's your priest or your bishop, your nuns, because with religion, there's supposed to be that comfort and love that is supposed to be prominent. And that's why it's surprising, not surprising, that that's an issue, because there's so much terror and horror and violence hidden within. It's not really hidden anymore, but it's an ongoing issue.
Michael, you haven't said a word. Can I get you to weigh in?
Well, I was going to weigh in, but what's your name again? Sam just said very eloquently the thought that I had kind of throughout the discussion here tonight, and that is that, yes, people will say, and they're right, that this child abuse and so on takes place throughout society, but as Sam just mentioned, I was sitting here thinking the same thing. Here you have people who are projecting themselves as, I hate to say holier than thou, but I'll say that for lack of a better term. So those with that thought in mind would be the last people in the world you would think would be guilty or engaging in this kind of conduct. And I think that's why it's so unbelievably shocking. The other thing too I was going to mention, by the way, is just to clarify something. I don't know how important a point this is or not, but the concept of infallibility was mentioned at least a couple of times during the conversation here tonight. And I just want to mention that the Catholic Church believes, or Catholics ought to believe, that the Pope is infallible when he calls upon his infallibility that Catholics ought to believe he has to, can't think of the right word, but declare something to be a doctrine of the Church, as opposed to, in other words, Catholics don't believe that every priest is infallible, or even the Pope is necessarily infallible, unless he, again, calls upon this procedure or what have you to invoke, if you will, his infallibility that Catholics believe he does have. And the last point I want to make just generally is, I think it's been referenced in some way or another by perhaps several folks here, early on at least in the discussion, that, I grew up Catholic, and I'm a Catholic, and I went to Catholic school all the way through high school, and we did view the priests and the people of the religious orders as, I won't say larger than life, but as though they were maybe held to a higher standard, or we believe that that's the way we grew up. We kind of looked at them as being role models or what have you. And when the question was asked at the beginning of the session for the one word that would describe how we felt, I used the word eye-opening, in that even though this was brought to light in the early 2000s with respect to the Altoona, Johnstown Diocese. When it really came to hit home here, because I live in the Harrisburg Diocese, it really did open my eyes to the extent that this stuff is not occurring somewhere else, it's occurring right here. So that would be my comment.
So we have a lot of Catholics, judging from what I've heard tonight. Is there anyone who has been driven away from their faith as a result of this crisis?
Years ago, not as a result of the grand jury report, but many years ago, I left the church.
I'm a recovering Catholic, so I guess I consider myself still a Catholic. But there are issues that I have to deal with. But yeah, I'm Catholic.
Go ahead, Orlando.
I think it's, I go to church. I'll admit I don't go every week. I certainly don't prescribe to every doctrine or belief that the church has. My wife says we're menu Catholics. You know, we pick as to what we believe. And you know, when I go to church, it's because I do believe there's a God, and it's an hour or it's an hour and a half of time to reflect on that. I don't think this has driven me away because, like you said, there were things way beyond this that may have done that. But when you think about the Catholic Church as put against other religions, and I've said this for when we got married eons ago, and I'm sure many of you have gone to, I think it's pre-Cana classes before you get married, and you're having an unmarried person tell you how you should live your life married. The church, we're a dynamic society, and the church is very static. And until it starts to become more dynamic, there's always going to be what we see happening. Whether it floats to the surface or not is another thing, but it's just, it's not moving with the times. It's just not.
I need married priests.
Yes, absolutely. And women priests.
Strongly.
Absolutely.
Final, Wayne, go ahead. Vincent.
Okay. When I look at it, I look across, like I'll be 60 in January, and looking at these things and me going my way in college and doing whatever I wanted to and coming back to the faith. It's a time for pruning, and it's almost a time for celebration. There's a time for hate, a time for love, for war. So it's a time to rebuild the church. So if it takes cutting off half the people, cutting off 2/3 of their money, let it be. The church is God's church. It is not man's. It is not built with man's hands. So when man sins and messes up things like these priests, these administrators, and the canon laws, which put these things in private and protect sinners, that's wrong. So let the church be tried by fire, and let's prune the vine so that it can be more bountiful.
All right.
Absolutely.
Paul, did you want to add anything?
Everybody, no, thank you. You did a really nice job.